This episode is sort of a continuation from my first episode on George Floyd, BLM, and police violence. My first episode focused on the limitations of the race reductionist and the liberal anti-racist line espoused by BLM and its supporters and activists. Additionally, I provided some data and research from Toure Reed, Vaquant, Clegg, and Usmani that demonstrate the importance of connecting race back to matters of political economy if we are able to have any hope of tackling the policing crisis in any significant way. Today I want to share more of my own thoughts regarding our current events. Now it's been several weeks since I released my last podcast episode on this topic. I took a break for about a week and spent the next couple weeks thinking about where this movement will go and really digging into some articles and podcasts, particularly those involving Professor Cedric Johnson. There was also a fantastic interview done by The Bellows with Walter Ben Michaels and Adolph Reed Jr. that was highly enlightening that I recommend also. I was interested in hearing about the various perspectives on our current issues. However, really the demands of work and life also got in the way, so I really apologize that I didn't release this episode sooner, and I'm really sorry about the delay. But anyways, back to the subject. So it's really hard to predict what will exactly happen with these protests, Black Lives Matter, and police reform. Things are always going to be in flux, and I'm not a fortune teller. But I think it can go in two different ways. Firstly, it can go towards a progressive, leftist, public good-focused model that will actually tackle the material causes and roots of the carceral crisis. There would be a focus on redistributive policies like the expansion of unions, public works, full employment, Medicare for all, public housing, and so on. This is about improving the material sphere of the most marginalized and vulnerable populations that are most likely to interact with the justice system through universal policies that uplift and benefit the working masses. The second path, and I think the one that is most likely to come about, is the tried and true neoliberal path. I'm going to explore this a bit more, but to sum it up, it's a projection of a social justice element within a capitalist framework. That includes actions and steps taken by corporations, city councils, elected officials, and so on, that present a form of justice that does not impinge upon the ability of capitalism to reproduce itself, the ability to extract wealth from bottom up, and the ability to accumulate surplus value or profit. Professor Cedric Johnson's most recent piece in Jacobin magazine titled, "Don't Let Blackwashing Save the Investor Class," argues that the anti-racist impulse spawning from the death of George Floyd is being enthusiastically taken up by major corporations like Walmart, Amazon, Uber, etc., to deflect from broader issues of inequality and exploitation spawning from profit maximization. Quote, "Within weeks, corporations pledged upward of $2 billion to various anti-racist initiatives and organizations. The leadership of Warner, Sony Music, and Walmart each committed $100 million. Google pledged $175 million, mainly to incubate Black entrepreneurship. YouTube announced a $100 million initiative to amplify Black media voices. Apple also pledged $100 million for the creation of its Racial Equity and Justice Initiative," end quote, notes Professor Johnson. Now, these companies are taking the opportunity to flex their anti-racist commitments by donating swaths of money into social justice organizations. The George Floyd uprisings also presented a convenient moment for corporations to create a marketing campaign in support of the protests and condemn racism and police brutality. Amazon released a tweet in solidarity with BLM and George Floyd reading, quote, "The inequitable and brutal treatment of Black people in our country must stop. Together, we stand in solidarity with the Black community, our employees, customers, and partners in the fight against systemic racism and injustice," end quote. Blue Shield ran an evocative commercial listing several prominent victims of police violence, including Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, while repeating the line, "Enough is enough." Now, people may think that this is a victory, that even private companies are taking note of the scale of the protests, the injustice, and the rage to adopt an anti-racist framework. But this gives the protests too much credit. Anti-racism actually falls comfortably within the confines of neoliberal capitalism. Coming out against racism and police brutality while preaching support and uplift of minority voices allows capitalism to operate with a social justice veneer, a human face. The supreme irony of all of this is Amazon continues to pay its workers pitifully low wages, fire workers who organize for better working conditions and PPE, such as Chris Smalls. Health insurance companies like Blue Shield, Blue Cross routinely deny people coverage and raise rates. Even my beloved NFL came out with an apologetic statement in support of the protests and anti-racism. Let's not forget that this was the same organization that blackballed Colin Kaepernick for taking a knee and cutting ties with a research organization after it found that repeated hits to the head was linked to CTE. By adopting or reaffirming an anti-racist stance, corporations are able to shield or deflect criticism and controversy over labor disputes, unethical business practices, exploitations, and so on and so on. It normalizes market logic, the relentless pursuit of wealth, and privatization of the public sphere, all in the name of eliminating racism and prejudice so that capitalism can run more efficiently and effectively. Now, I've talked about the insufficiency of the race reductionist anti-racist framework espoused by left liberals and contemporary activists in my last episode. If we're not able to direct the diverse political forces towards a progressive redistributive agenda, the dominant liberal anti-racist and anti-disparitarian ideology will only produce solutions wholly incapable of addressing the carceral crisis and the deep-seated inequality prevalent in our society. There's a reason why this kind of amorphous Black Lives Matter slogan and anti-racist line has been warmly embraced and flaunted by corporations, politicians, cough cough, kente cloth wearing useless Democratic senators that shun progressive policies like Medicare for All, Green New Deal, and free college that actually help working class Black and brown lives for performative gestures, NGOs, and foundations. It's clear that this sort of gestural, performative, symbolic kind of politics has replaced any sort of politics dedicated to universal policies geared towards the working masses. As Professor Emeritus Adolph Reed Jr. said, race politics is class politics. It is a kind of politics embraced by the professional managerial stratum of all colors and stripes, the elites, as well as sections of the middle and upper class, that will not threaten the existing class relations, power structures, continued wealth extraction, and profiteering of corporations. From implementing diversity offices in institutions, placing minorities on corporate boards, changing the name of the Washington Redskins, to taking down statues, which I'll discuss later, this kind of thinking emphasizes a reckoning with race, self-criticism, coming to terms with white supremacy, in lieu of actual measures and policies that improve the lives of working people, the poor, and those in poverty, ironically, disproportionately Black, brown, and Native American. But conversely, the Bernie Sanders campaign, which linked issues of race and prejudice to matters of political economy, such as Medicare for All, Housing for All, jobs programs, free college, and so on, faced enormous flack, misreporting, and disdain from news media, pundits, neoliberal politicians, corporations, and elites. The Sanders movement made us think about racism and discrimination not as permanent afflictions that manifest themselves through individual choices and actions, but as inequalities and injustices created and sustained by capitalist forces and policies such as privatization, for-profit healthcare, stagnant wages, and so on. Policies that have thoroughly decimated the poor and working class of all colors, sexes, and genders. Former chairman of the U.S. Labor Party, Mark Dudzik, wrote, quote, "The Sanders campaign was so disorienting to conservatives and liberals because it did not embrace these naturalized categories, racism and sexism, but instead revealed them as social relationships established by real human beings and thus open to change through the application of political and economic policies. After stumbling a bit in the early months around how to give voice to the outrages of police violence and mass incarceration, it laid out a working-class politics of hope that was both visionary and practical. In the process, it helped lay bare the actual mechanisms of capitalism that drove inequality, and exposed the fault lines created by decades of neoliberalism that are impeding real change in the labor, racial justice, and other social movements." End quote. The liberal anti-racist frame the discussion of disparities and racism within growing inequality produced by neoliberal capitalism is wholly insufficient in producing the policies we need to combat police violence, inequality, racism, and injustice. While history remains fluid and anything can happen, I am skeptical that the current debates and struggles revolving around police reform and racism will go beyond abysmally lackluster fixes such as diversifying the professional managerial class, placing minorities in executive positions and on corporate boards, implicit bias training, expanding the race relations industry, new marketing campaigns, and the inclusion of more minorities into elite institutions such as Harvard and Yale. While this is a notion of justice for some, particularly those who have the resources and skills, as Adolph Reed Jr. would say, it's a form of equality that is compatible with a society where 1% of the population own 90% of the wealth, provided that the 1% is comprised of a proportionate amount of blacks, gays, women, Latinos, and any other identity group. However, if you're someone that believes in egalitarian outcomes and an economic system that produces for human need, not profit, then it's certainly a notion of justice that shouldn't be acceptable, at least not for the poor and working class. Another interesting topic is the defund the police movement. That slogan, along with abolish the police, circulated rapidly among activists and social media during the last weeks of May and the majority of June. It quickly picked up steam and eventually broke into the mainstream news networks like CNN, Fox, and the New York Times. Activists have forced local officials in places like Minneapolis, Chicago, and New York City to rethink how financial resources are allocated to police, but there is confusion regarding the exact meaning behind defund the police. Some take it to mean slashing police budgets and reallocating money to social programs like drug treatment programs, housing, job training, or the hiring of counselors, mental health specialists, and social workers to handle situations where police would be inappropriate. Some are calling for complete abolition of the police force. There's definitely a lot of support for police reform, but abolishing or defunding the police isn't something that a significant amount of Americans are on board with. According to a HuffPost/YouGov poll conducted on June 10th, 73% of individuals support banning police officers from using chokeholds, 72% support creating a federal registry for complaints against police officers, 69% support developing a national standard for when police officers can use force, 68% support making it easier for the federal government to charge police officers for using excessive force. However, when we look at the level of support for defunding the police, 57% of individuals oppose it. Even when we look at the idea of defunding police and isolate race, there's still a significant amount of blacks that do not support it. 49% of blacks in the aforementioned poll oppose defunding the police and 29% support, compared to 60% of whites that oppose it and 26% that support defunding the police. While less blacks oppose defunding the police, 49% is still a very high number and should reveal how complex the situation is regarding how we talk about police reform and the different interests at play. A noteworthy finding in this poll is the significant boost in support of defunding the police of those with a postgraduate degree compared to those without a college degree. If we were to accept the absence of a college degree or the presence of a postgraduate degree as proxies or markers for class, then it appears to me that even lower class or poor individuals want some form of policing around. A more recent poll conducted by a partnership of Ipsos/USA Today/Public Agenda between June 18th to the 22nd shows wide support for police reform. 55% of Americans want either major change or to redesign it completely. 87% of people support police officers undergoing de-escalation training, 82% want officers to undergo implicit bias training, and 76% support hiring more Black or African American police officers. Furthermore, 90% support police body cameras, and 78% support having a national registry of police who have used excessive force and prohibiting other jurisdictions from rehiring them. Although there is wide support for police reform, the idea of defunding the police is much more controversial and is less supported by the American public. 538.com took 4 polls and posted it on their website so people can see the level of support and the level of opposition to defunding the police. So we have a poll from June 14th to the 16th by The Economist/YouGov. 24% support defunding the police, while 53% oppose. There was a Morning Consult/political poll where 28% support defunding the police, while 58% oppose. And then there's a ABC News/Ipsos poll where 34% support defunding the police and 64% oppose. And finally, we have a poll from Reuters/Ipsos where 39% of individuals support defunding the police and 57% oppose. When phrased along lines of shifting financial resources towards social services, some of the polls garnered different responses. I didn't report these results, but given the vague nature of the defund the police slogan and its various interpretations, one can expect varied responses based on framing. So according to the polls, people clearly want police reform and they want to remove the excessive force aspect of it and the racism. However, they still see a role for police in their communities and are not supportive of defunding or abolishing the police. If you think about policing as a means to control inequality and protect the property and lifestyles of the middle and upper class, then of course there's going to be people who are either indifferent or against defunding them. Even poor communities struck by crime may support the police and want more effective policing and public safety rather than defund. In the Ipsos/USA Today poll, 63% of people wanted police to focus on more serious and violent crimes rather than misdemeanors or deterrent activities. A striking 57% of respondents supported sending social workers and EMTs to respond to mental health crises, substance abuse issues, and domestic violence issues in lieu of police officers, a number that seemed kinda low to me. The idea of having counselors and social workers respond to school safety instead of police officers garnered the same percentage of support as well. This poll makes it clear that Americans are split on what the appropriate police response to certain incidents should be. Now, before you jump to the conclusion that I'm a white supremacist for pointing this information out, I'm not saying that defunding the police is a bad idea. I would love to see more financial resources allocated towards public housing, job creation, healthcare, education, infrastructure improvement, and so on. For example, my home city of San Francisco has a major homelessness problem and affordable housing crisis. Instead of having city employees and police bust homeless people for sleeping on the streets, money should definitely be allocated towards the building of shelters, public housing, towards harm reduction centers, towards SROs, for inpatient therapy, things that provide a social good. One modest measure that San Francisco city leaders are proposing is the construction of navigation centers in every city district to provide resources and services to the homeless population. However, there's been significant pushback from the ritzy waterfront and downtown areas, from HOAs, from real estate companies, and middle-class neighborhoods like the Sunset District. And, these people expect a certain level of consumption, of cleanliness, of safety, a certain kind of lifestyle. They're afraid that the increased homeless population in those neighborhoods would drive down property values. They're afraid that it's going to attract crime and tarnish the area that they reside in. It's going to be an ongoing battle between different political forces, city leaders, activists, organizations, and other interest groups to determine what the response to the affordable housing and homelessness crisis will be and how it will look like. So just back to the topic of police reform, there's a lot of ideas being pushed about how to handle the policing crisis and so on. Like the polls suggested, there's things ranging from defunding police, body cameras, democratic oversight committees, hiring practices, changes to qualified immunity, banning of tear gas and rubber bullets, removing police from schools, de-escalation training. You get the drill. There's no shortage of reforms that would be beneficial in tackling police violence and the criminal justice system. Now, depending on what jurisdiction you live in, your community might have different priorities. For some, like in San Francisco, it might be bail reform, it could be diversion programs. For other jurisdictions, it might be just body cameras. For other places, it might be hiring practices and use of force guidelines. This is all great, and I'm super interested and supportive of getting these policies implemented. However, I really think that we have to go further. In my last podcast, I talked about how policing is used to address inequality and surplus population in lieu of the welfare state. It's not enough to just have these policing and criminal justice reforms. It might blunt the excesses of policing, but it doesn't change the population that is most likely to be policed, arrested, incarcerated, and killed, which are the poor, the marginalized, and vulnerable segments of the working class. Unless we address the conditions that produce this population, we will continue to have the disparities, the controversial police killings, and the most incarcerated on the planet. Now, considering the corporate response, as well as a refocus on interpersonal attitudes by left liberals and activists, I have little faith that the much-needed proposals will even be imagined. One reason why I bring up the defund the police movement and the split poll numbers regarding it is oftentimes an idea that is popular among activists or those on social media may not actually be well received by the general public. Considering that social media often operates on an algorithm to control the content we want to see, there's the illusion of support among our social media contacts and who we interact with. Furthermore, the people we choose to keep and include in our social media circles like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram probably hold similar views to us. This kind of false confidence also stems from the ease of sharing videos and pictures on the internet, of which some become viral and are viewed, shared, and retweeted tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times. You've probably seen tons of pictures of the massive crowds, clenched fists, burned out buildings, the faces of rage and anger, and so on. Now, these images and videos can be powerful and awe-inspiring. However, pictures and videos can often lead to a decontextualization of a moment. What I mean by that is it's easy to ascribe some kind of revolutionary potential, militancy, or success without a serious consideration of the political forces, how strong we are, how well organized, who is our base of support, what kind of alliances or coalitions do we have, how will the ruling class respond, basic questions like this. It's super easy to look at the size of the crowds and think, wow, there's so much support on our side, we're going to make sweeping changes. It's really easy to view pictures of angry protesters raising a clenched fist and projecting some sort of revolutionary energy that is in gestation. A more recent example is the march of armed protesters at Stone Mountain, Georgia. It can be really easy to proclaim the birth of a movement just by participating or viewing some notorious or bombastic action when the last 20 years, including the March for Our Lives, the Women's March, the anti-war protests, the Occupy movement, and so on, have shown that mere bodies on the street and militant sloganeering have produced very little for the average working person. When the tear gas dissipates and the protests end, how will we go about achieving our goals? While I'm not suggesting that we let poll numbers dictate our course of action or let it dampen our energy and enthusiasm on a particular issue, if we feel strongly about something, of course we should make it happen. What I am proposing is a more honest and analytical evaluation of our current moment. and how we got here, the strategies that we are employing, how we cultivate a base, how we form alliances, how to build solidarity, and so on. Regarding the destruction of monuments, I'm not particularly attached to them, so I'm generally glad to see them come down, especially since they're part of the legacy of the treasonous states of America and their insurrection against the United States government. There's bound to be people who experience emotional pain and anguish from seeing the statues, but at the end of the day, I think it's just symbolism and we should direct our energy towards more concerning things. I would love to see these individuals that are worked up about statues and monuments direct their rage and energy towards getting material benefits enacted like public works programs, Medicare for all, free college, housing, union expansion, and so on. Not only are the monuments kind of low-hanging fruit, but it's also, dare I say, pointless. There are countless statues, signposts, memorials, and so on that probably contain the names of unscrupulous characters. It would be absolutely impractical to focus our political efforts into removing all these symbols. Moreover, since racism is amorphous and can be interpreted in many different ways, it could even be a never-ending project. Additionally, the impetus to remove the statues falls under a neoliberal logic. Professor Emeritus Adolf Reed summed up this form of thinking in the following quote: 1. The monuments were erected to celebrate white supremacist power, which is the foundation of slavery, lynching, and brutalization of black New Orleanians, disenfranchisement, imposition of Jim Crow, and denial of blacks' basic civil rights. 2. The fact that they remain on display in the present underscores the continuity of white supremacy's power. 3. That continuity indicates that, as in the past, contemporary racial inequalities most meaningfully result from white supremacy, which therefore must be the primary target of struggles for social and racial justice. End quote. However, by taking down these statues and monuments, activists are reinforcing the race reductionist belief that racism and white supremacy are the primary forces that cause the historic and present injustices we are facing. Of course, racism is bad, but that framing normalizes and overlooks the damage that capitalism has wrought on people, its diverse participants that contribute to its reproduction, and the notion that we just need a less racist and more diverse capitalism rather than transforming our system of production and distribution. It's so frustrating seeing how fired up and excited people are to tear down these statues, but aren't displaying the same level of vitriol towards someone like Jeff Bezos or the pharmaceutical companies or whatnot. I'm not trying to be the gatekeeper here and tell you what politics you should or should not do, but come on, man. Priorities. Come on. There's some real crap out there making life miserable for poor and working class people, especially people of color. Now, culture, values, and attitudes change over time. Of course, slavery is horrible. Racism and white supremacy are horrible. The way we look at society and the world now, it's very different from the attitudes, concerns, and beliefs of people from the 18th and 19th century. Projecting the conditions and beliefs of the present backwards in time to make judgments on people and society in the past glosses over the historical and material conditions people operated in. If you go searching for ugly instances of racism, prejudice, discrimination, and whatnot, of course you're going to find it. And considering that racism is like terrorism, which is an analogy that Adolf Reed uses, it can be whatever shape or form the person wants it to be. Just the other day in San Francisco, they took down a Ulysses S. Grant statue because he supposedly owned a slave. It was later said by others that Grant inherited a slave from his father-in-law and had the slave set free. The ultimate irony is that Grant was instrumental to the defeat of the Confederacy. Apparently there's also been some chatter about taking down Abraham Lincoln statues because he didn't fight the Civil War primarily to free the slaves. I'm generally indifferent to the removal of statues, but these takes are just plain bad and awful. You're looking at history and the people back then in the way you want to see them, and not in an actual historical manner that takes into account the conditions, circumstances, structures, and values that people operated in. So in other words, you're rewriting the past to suit the present. So in closing, there's been a lot of support for Black Lives Matter and commitments to social justice this year, and I'm really happy about that. Public opinion seems to be shifting towards acknowledging that police use excessive force, especially towards people of color. But there are times where some of the support comes off so tacky and kind of corny, sometimes to the level of unseriousness. Several weeks ago, while walking home after hanging out with Ryan, the other member of the Rice Club, I stumbled upon chalk drawings of Black Lives Matter on the sidewalk, and then I noticed 2 houses with posters reading Black Lives Matter on their living room windows. It comes off as tacky because as a slogan, it's easily used, displayed, muttered, and so on. You're not really giving up anything by acknowledging it. Considering our present discourse around politics, social media, and cancel culture, politics has become more about taking a stand and moralizing rather than strategic thinking, coalition building, and organizing for power. I'm already seeing countless posts on subtle Asian traits that sound more like self-criticism over one's lack of anti-racist commitment, performances of self-flagellation, professions of guilt and privilege, and the need for Asians to support BLM. And I can kind of understand why, because if someone is new to politics, then these are things that people kind of naturally gravitate towards. But I think we have to go further. It's really easy to wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt or carry a sign and go to a protest. It's pretty easy to make a Facebook post acknowledging your ignorance or privilege. It's easy to profess an anti-racist commitment, while at the same time keeping the privileges of wealth, neighborhood safety, financial security, a well-paying job, good schools, and so on. I'm not telling people to quit their jobs and to live in a commune, but what I am interested in is seeing commitments that go beyond self-righteous posturing and moralism that's so prevalent these days around activists and liberal circles. While we squabble over monuments, the meaning of allyship, and who has the legitimate voice, the ruling class is working overtime to deflect all attention away from the issues of class power, exploitation, and political economy. Better get our act together.